So delighted to be able to have this opportunity to share. And as I look at my collection of slides, I have far too much to say. So I'm going to flip through this very quickly and maybe just bounce past some screens without comment. I'm sharing some interdisciplinary reflections, which some might consider a mile wide and an inch deep, but that has a value to it that's different from being an inch wide and a mile deep. We can see some broader perspectives by sharing things. We will pause very briefly at the end of each five sessions, and if there is a really urgent question, you can pass that along to David in the chat function, and we'll take a brief pause to catch a breath and then dive into the next one and have, I hope, time for more stuff at the end. We'll be looking at 5 different sort of topics. I'll do a quick theological prelude. We'll move very quickly through some scientific things that I think most of us who have been part of this forum have heard many times, and then get into some reflections on social change and what's up with the pandemic, and lead into some final decisions and discussions. So with that, stealing from a presentation I have done elsewhere, speaking in my role as somebody who has worked with Christian churches, and the Christian churches have generally not understood ecology historically. And so I go back to some basics on this. In Christian theology, we have affirmed that God is love, that the primary quality of God is a matter of relationship and engagement. And even within the Godhead, the notion of the Trinity says that there is relationship within God. God simply can't exist without relationship. The big visions of shalom, or the realm of God, are all about right relationship within communities. They're not individual conditions, but they're community factors. As we look at the world around us, and what some Christian people call the God's book of nature, we see that gravity is everywhere. Gravity holds together galaxies. And at the molecular level, atomic relationships hold molecules together. In human society, all sorts of fields of study look at relationships within human systems. And in the natural world, ecology is the study of those complex relationships. Ethicist Larry Rasmussen wrote, I think this one was about 12 years ago, that nature is a community is the scientific discovery of the 20th century. That Earth, human society included, is also a community has not yet registered with us. At least how to sustain it as a community has not. So we can quickly see that God's creation is inherently relational. We really shouldn't expect anything other than that from a God who is all about relationship. The challenge is that our economic system doesn't understand those sorts of relationships. It looks only at objects with monetary values. It looks at individual choices as the primary things in a free market system. So a relational theology doesn't look just at individuals or objects alone, but looks at communities and relationships and the web of life. It finds great insights and understanding in what science tells us about the world. It's richly ecological and concerned with social justice. If the world is inherently relational, then those ecological and sociological and biophysical relationships are part of the structure of the world. And we can't just pretend that we can ignore those or make them go away or change them to suit our convenience. As several commentators have said about the work on climate change, nature does not negotiate. Nature says 350 parts per million is the safe level of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if we say, you know, that's awkward economically, we'd really much rather have 450 be the safe level, we don't get to do that. The relationships of the world say that, tell us what's real. And so to condense all of that into a 1-minute summary, if I can get this to share correctly, we'll hear from the wombat.
Yo, listen up. This is your home. It's the only one you got. This place is pretty, but you can't live there. You can't even get there. So I repeat, this is your home. It's the only one you got. Cherish it, protect it. It's the only one you're going to get. These guys, they're your neighbors. They ain't going away. They ain't leaving. You have to get along with them. So you have to learn to share. You have to get along. You have to learn to get along because they are your neighbors. They're not going away. Okay, all this stuff, the animals, the waters, the sky, the ground, the bugs, the fish, the tacos, the people, they're all connected. Everything is connected. They all depend on one another. If you ignore that, you're doomed. Repeat, doomed. Okay, so listen up. It's all one. Not two worlds, not three, one. Just one. So get it and give. Remember, all is one. Okay? Hit it.
And what else can I say? Oh, we lost the screen sharing. So that's the end of the first section. Are there any things showing up in the comments that we need to deal with right away, or should we keep plowing ahead quickly? I don't see anything there.
Nothing new in comments. In the chat.
All right. So we move quickly to the science. And
Actually, I have a question.
Oh, yep.
How did you come up with wombat?
That was produced by the Center for Global Community in 2005. And back then, 15 years ago, it went viral on the early internet. And I love to pull it out on occasion because it is just such a lovely, creative thing. It has, I think, 104 words in a 1-minute presentation. None of them are over 3 syllables, and any word and any concept in there can be understood by a 3rd grader. I'm jealous of that sort of statement.
So it's probably the alliteration of wisdom and wombat.
I have no idea why they chose the wombat to be the symbol of it, but it's great fun.
It was good.
Pretty adorable.
And when the slides go out, I'll put a link to how you can see that for yourself. Center for Global Community says you're welcome to download it and share it. I turned it from an old media format into a more usable one, so feel free to pass it around. Are we ready to dive into science? To get us started, a few quick exercises in how we look at information and data and presentations of stuff. Take a close look at this pie chart. Sometimes things are not just data. They're actually something else. Here's what a chart shows. That might be what you look if you looked at a mountain range through a tennis racket. On that note, we need to laugh sometimes because this is heavy stuff. There was a notion a number of years ago first put out about a number of planetary boundaries that our planet system simply cannot function well when those are exceeded. And it was fascinating to me when that first came out that climate change is not the only crisis on there or even the worst crisis. Biodiversity loss is labeled as by far the most serious crisis. The nitrogen cycle, the overuse of fertilizers that poison soil and causes the dead zones in the oceans is second highest. And climate change is really just on this chart moving out into the danger zone. A theologian a number of years ago said, for the first time, our power to destroy outstrips Earth's power to restore. And when we move outside of that safe operation level, we are in that realm of exercising more destroying power than restorative power. So we will move into a couple of these great crises. Get your glasses if you need to, and we'll head in. From that chart, the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of species was seen as one of the great crises. We've heard about plummeting populations of honeybees for a number of years and have started to get some sense of the ecological and economic repercussions of that. Our food system would be in mortal danger if we stopped with readily available honeybees. We've also heard about dramatic losses and bleaching of coral reefs as oceans warm and become more acidic. Those are old news. Last November, I believe it was, the New York Times had a major report that they called the insect apocalypse that was eye-opening for me, about not just honeybees or monarch butterflies, but across the spectrum of insect life, the rapidly declining numbers of those insects. And then last spring, the UN had a major report on biodiversity loss that went into far more detail. That report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that will not be on the test, said that humanity is a dominant global influence on life on Earth and has caused natural terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems to decline, rate more so than before. The rate is already at least tens to hundreds of times higher than the average rate over the past 10 million years and is accelerating. And the headline piece that was popping up all over the media sphere last spring was that 8 to 13% of all species on Earth could be extinct within just a few decades. Quick glance at this chart and some of their notions of what is vulnerable or endangered or critically endangered. I'm intrigued that insects are not generally listed on here, but 2/3 of the way down, coral-forming reefs are listed, and they're not put in the highly endangered view, which makes me really worry about the amphibians and the cyads that are the most stressed. In that report, they said nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably while simultaneously meeting other global society goals through urgent and concerted efforts at fostering transformative change. And the chair of that commission said, by transformative change, we mean a fundamental, system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. They are not talking about a technical fix. And this graphic from their report looked at the many different indirect and direct drivers of species extinction and some of the levers that can be used to make differences on that, and then the leverage points for working towards transformation that are embrace diverse visions of a good life, reduce consumption and waste, unleash values and actions, reduce inequalities, practice justice and inclusion and conservation, and on down the list. Obviously, if we're going to deal with this calamitous decline in species, it will take profound changes in how our global human society works. Switching over to climate change, as you remember in the fall of 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a big report that was charted to find out, is it indeed possible to hold warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius? And they said, yes, it is possible. And doing so would be a much better thing than getting up to 2 degrees. And like with the biodiversity report, they said, getting there will be easier if we have a strong emphasis on economic and social justice. And the scary thing about the IPCC report was they made it clear that we have to have a major turn with very real effects by 2030, 10 years from now, to essentially cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half. And as they admitted, that is an unprecedented challenge for humanity. This week, the observatory in Hawaii says that our CO2 levels are at 416.92 parts per million. And most of the folk in this group are aware that 350 parts per million is considered the sort of safe level. We are way above that. The classic graph of 800,000 years of climate stuff and This vertical line on the edge is the absurdity of what has happened as we've begun the use of fossil fuels. Again, from the IPCC report, if we don't make changes, the trajectory of our emissions puts us above the 1.5 degree line before 2040, and that seems strikingly realistic these days. They say we have to cut emissions dramatically. We are here at or beyond the point when they say those cuts have to be kicking in and get down to net zero by 2050 with both CO2, methane, black carbon, and nitrous oxide emissions. They said that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, but doing so would require unprecedented changes. They're basically saying that if we attempt to maintain business as usual with only some technical fixes, let's go put up solar panels and windmills and have a few more electric cars, we will have roadblocks to getting there. If we're willing to take a larger look at how to make our global society more just and sustainable, then we have more possibilities open to us. You may have heard about, I think it was last fall, a gathering in Iceland at the site of a former glacier, Ak. And they put a plaque there with an inscription in Icelandic and English. Ak is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all of the other Icelandic glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument, this plaque, is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you, in the future, will know if we did it. It's heavy-duty news, and we need to find ways of coping with it. There's the science part. Moving fast. Any quick questions, comments, screams of being overwhelmed, anything like that?
Peter, it's Anita. Will we have time later to talk about various ways of looking at the good life?
You can raise that question later, yes.
Okay, will do.
Thank you. We'll get to pieces of that as we go along, too.
Peter, quick question. I'm interested in the IPCC saw non-technological ways as the solution. Are they open to seeing as technology could help, or?
Oh, technology is absolutely essential. And not only the acts of shifting to renewable energy and conserving energy, but they say virtually any scenario will require active efforts to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They also point at dealing with deforestation and land use and excessive consumption and transportation issues. They look at virtually every sector of society and find important ways of addressing that. And we're going to have to use them all and do them fast. So simply technology won't do it, which, and I'll try not to go into this, but the controversial movie about the human planet, if you could figure out from the clutter of other things, was making the point that some parts of the modern environmental movement are suggesting that we can just put up wind panel or solar panels and wind turbines and continue with the American way of life and we'll be fine. And they're saying, no, we can't do that. And that is absolutely true.
Thank you.
Are we ready to bounce into social change?
There are no further comments in the chat room, so go ahead.
Thank you for watching that. And as I look back over the years, I don't think we, with the EEE Forum, have had a lot of explicit topics that deal with matters of methods of social change or aspects of political power. So we may be into a little bit different realm on this, although I actually have presented some of this before with Triple E, which means I can move faster on that. That plaque in Iceland says, "We acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you in the future will know if we did it." And those things that we've looked at in the science section, species extinction, climate chaos, and a whole batch of other crises, are at least a political process is needed to address that. Having political change requires good ideas or bad ideas. We've seen a lot of political change that happens with bad ideas, but it also requires political power. Oh, and now I need to switch to a different thing. So let me stop sharing for just a moment. I have too many windows going on here. I can't get out of this one. Well, we will skip a brief thing from Barack Obama. Can you see me still? Because I lost everybody else.
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay. Get too many windows open and you lose it here. There's a video clip of Barack Obama saying that whether you're looking at a local level or the United Nations, questions about political power are if you have a community behind you, then you have power. If you don't have a community supporting what you're trying to do, then you don't have power. So, yeah, we skip that. It seems to me that as I look at efforts for political change, some, especially on the liberal side, haven't paid attention to political power. They've acted as if having the right ideas and having the truth was a good guarantee. And I've heard that especially in the climate realm, with the notion that if we just go teach the politicians enough about the climate science, they'll go do the right thing. And we have found over the years that that doesn't work. And I've also seen that many, certainly progressives, have placed great hope in democracy as the way to bring about change. And I'm sure all of you have seen innumerable action alerts that say, this is what's going on, so call your senator or be sure to get out and vote, because those are the two primary ways that we can make change happen. But it doesn't always work that way. And I look especially at some of the stuff we've seen in the news recently, and my idealistic notions of civics and democracy are pretty well challenged when I see Mitch McConnell as head of the US Senate, who will not even hold hearings on a Supreme Court nominee, who simply says, no, we won't do that. And I see the Trump administration slamming through changes to environmental rules or immigration policies without political support and without following proper procedures, and only sometimes do the courts block them on that. We've seen states that are implementing gerrymandering and voter suppression that basically says, we don't care what the voters want. We are going to manipulate the system to get what we want out of it. And here in Colorado, we've seen our junior senator who doesn't bother to make personal appearances around the state, or on times of a lot of controversial things, doesn't even bother to have his staff answer the phone. So the notion that the political process is all about having a community that supports your values and speaking clearly may be something we need to question. We're seeing two different and conflicting versions of how political power works. There's the notion of we, the people, who are actually the bosses of the politicians, and we will tell them what they need to say and do. And we have the hardcore politics that will draw power for its own ends. And we will, in a little bit, look at the notion that Naomi Klein has put out of disaster capitalism. And so I've looked strictly at political power on this fast run through. There's also clearly economic power that's at work. There are occasions when moral authority and moral power has been important. Military power and the threat of force has an influence. And legal power is also important. And I have looked with great hope to the courts to see us through some of these things with various degrees of excitement and disappointment through the years. So we need to ask, how do we use our power? Cartoon. The militant hardliners are making demands, the fanatical zealots are issuing threats, and the moderate centrists are offering suggestions, which is what the mainstream politics often slips into, writing polite letters to members of Congress that doesn't exercise our power. And we need to think carefully about what it is that we're asking for. As we go out and make our demands, are we asking for real change, or are we looking for things that are a little bit less challenging? I've run through what I see as 3 approaches to change, broad-based social change, a number of years ago with EEE, and I will dance through this very quickly, but I've looked at how different groups consider how well the system works, the system complex of politics and economics and legal systems and cultural values. Just, is this business as usual stuff working well? The group that I've called the conformists say, yeah, it's basically okay. Things are going well. The activists say, well, the institutions are okay in principle, but they're not living up to what they should be. So we need to do things to make the institutions and the systems work better. And a transformational approach looks at the society and says, no, we can't tweak this. It is deeply flawed. It's based on the wrong values, and we have to do something far deeper if we're going to work at that, bring about change in that. And there's different questions that they ask, different approaches that they use in working for change, and different strategies that I won't go into right now, but I've seen these as 3 really significantly different ways of understanding how the world works and how social change has to happen. And it's not just a spectrum where you can ooze from one end to the other. They're defining very distinctive styles. The conformists and the activists on various levels are asking, what is it we can do, either personally or in legal systems or economic stimuluses? The transformational system asks, who are we and where are we going? And as we deal with those questions of identity, then we start asking about how we live and act. And the transformational side is looking systemically and intersectionally with a cross-hatching of all sorts of different issues and constituencies. The transformational approach is one I've played with for over 20 years, with the notion of a sumo wrestler, the big Japanese guy. What sort of arguments do you use to get a sumo wrestler to lose 100 pounds? And when we talk this through in a small group, we can spend some time and say, none of the basic functional, practical reasons will do it. The sumo wrestler will lose 100 pounds when he stops being a sumo wrestler. And U.S. society is the sumo wrestler of the world in terms of consumption and energy use and setting values. It takes a transformational change for us to look at doing the sorts of things that were named as transformational needs with climate change and biodiversity loss and the stuff we saw earlier. So here's my painful question, and we'll loop back to this at the end. My analysis of what science tells us is that transformational change is necessary to address the big crises of our world. But I don't see clearly expressed transformational values or empowered constituencies behind them that can trigger that depth of change in the time that we have. We can work at smaller steps of incremental change, but those aren't going to be sufficient to turn our society as strongly and as quickly as we need. And so the painful question is, with those tensions, how do we act effectively? And I'll be asking for your good answers on that at the end. Into section 3. Oh, David, any questions showing up?
Nope.
Nope. I've overwhelmed everybody. Okay, on to the pandemic. Just for, if things weren't complicated enough, let's see where we're going now. It's only been like 5 months, and Earth's human societies around the planet have been profoundly disrupted. Economies have crashed, governments have poured trillions of dollars into relief programs, and the big crises are still absolutely with us. But the context in which we can act on those is profoundly different. A few months ago, there were a couple articles, there we go. Margaret Bullitt Jonas and Leah Shade had written recently a book for faith communities on climate action. And they put together 7 points that they thought were lessons that we can learn from the pandemic that might guide us in climate action. And you can skim down the list, but science matters. The sooner we mobilize, the better we are. We can make drastic changes very quickly. We're all vulnerable. A vision of a just future will guide us into the future. And we need practices that keep us spiritually resilient. Cristina Figueres, who used to be head of the UN Climate Study Group, I believe, also had 5 lessons for the coronavirus that we can apply to climate activism. Recognition that these things don't have national borders. We're only as safe as our most vulnerable people. These need systemic changes, not personal responses. Prevention is better than cure, and again, we need to pay attention to science. As I look at those 2 lists, saying here are things we can learn from the pandemic, how does the pandemic help us to work for change? You may have heard optimistic things saying, well, you know, as societies have shut down, the earth is healing itself. In a matter of just a couple of weeks over China, the nitrous oxide levels just absolutely plummeted. There were stories about people in India being able to see the Himalayan mountains for the first time because the air pollution was reduced. The canals in Venice cleaned up. Wildlife is sort of emerging from the shadows and being more visible. We have a sense, oh, it's going to get better if we can just keep this up. But it may not be that cheerful. I've heard that deforestation in the Amazon has dramatically increased while the pandemic has been going on, up 64% in April from the year before. Some climate emissions may be going down, but methane emissions could actually be increasing as oil and fossil fuel companies have less supervision, they're saving money and just getting careless. So we are seeing things getting worse in some important ways. The people who do those global climate measurements we're dealing with a question, well, how much is the slowdown of the US or the global economy going to reduce carbon levels? And they said fossil fuel use would have to decline by about 10% around the world and be held at that level for a year to see any difference in global carbon levels. You know, the emission drop in China for a few months was a significant drop, but if we were to get that 10% decline held for a year, it would reduce global CO2 levels by about 0.5 part per million, which is nowhere near the levels of reducing emissions and carbon levels that we need to address warming. So yeah, that figure really frightens me because it looks like we have made big changes in our society right now, and yet on the level of measuring global carbon levels, it's essentially trivial. Here in the US, I've seen 2 conflicting worldviews showing up. I'm sure you've seen the same thing. We've actually had a fairly remarkable and engaged response where majorities of people are accepting the science and embracing the sense of community and the common good and putting up with the remarkable restrictions of people's lives. And then there is a quite small but vocal minority that's ignoring the science, insisting on their personal freedoms and protesting any restrictions. And others who are saying, we just got to protect the economy, and some people will get lost in the shuffle. Naomi Klein, who has been a fascinating commentator for a number of years, has written about the shock doctrine or disaster capitalism, where there are intentional efforts to use times like this for stark profit mongering, claiming this time for implementing agendas that would otherwise be met with great opposition, not just economically, but politically. And so we see coming out of Washington, while we're all tied up with this, notions of cutting payroll taxes or killing off the post office. Naomi wrote about the big tech companies that are moving into New York and saying, gee, kids are learning fine online. Why don't you just not worry about having schools and we'll do all the online education, which may be very profitable for them, but is horrible for families and kids and teachers and society. So what kind of recovery are we looking at from the pandemic in coming months? The latest proposal from the House, which apparently doesn't stand a chance in the Senate, includes some aspects of a green recovery, of looking at working for efficiency or renewable energy as a part of the recovery program. The previous relief bills have already provided support to the fossil fuel industries and the airlines, taking us in the wrong direction. And I'm afraid that if the next big stimulus pushes us, says, let's get back to business as usual, let's go build more highways, let's build more pipelines, let's increase the factory output, then I'm afraid that the path to climate catastrophe will be pretty well locked in for the next 10 or 20 years as we launch our global society in that direction. End of 4, we're getting there. Any questions? 3,
Unmute yourself if you want it. There's nothing in the chat room.
3, 2, 1. Oh, there's one. You made it. Yes. Do we have somebody with a question?
Well, I'm curious about the Scripps report. My understanding was if we started to reduce greenhouse gases 10 years ago, it would require a 3.6 reduction in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. And now it requires a 7.6% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I thought that was from the IPCC report. But so I'm confused about the Scripps analysis.
And I've just seen a blog posting on that. I have not been able to track down in-depth reports, but their notion that if we could maintain a 10% decrease at this point, it might stop the rise of CO2 levels, but it would, at that level, at that point, only be a very small reduction year by year.
Now, is it possible is it possible that they're factoring in methane release from the Arctic?
That could be quite possible, yeah. So, but clearly, the sort of people aren't driving to work and there's half as many airplane flights as there used to be is not getting us to the level of change that is going to solve climate change. So, sort of pulling these pieces together, the old crises that we have worried about are still out there. We have 10 years to cut greenhouse emissions by 50%. And I don't see anything within US policies that come close to getting us at that level of response. Biodiversity loss is still being addressed sort of on a species by species basis. We get appeals about butterflies or suggestions that we build beehives in our backyard, but nobody is talking about the complete transformative change that that UN report was talking about. We see other social justice crises that have become very visible recently. The stark inequality of wealth and income in this country, poverty, matters of access to and affordability of healthcare. As we hit this point of the pandemic, there's a term biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann talks about with the Psalms of disorientation, where the system changes so dramatically that we start to see the world and ourselves differently. And Brueggemann says that in that the old normal, the way we used to be, the things we used to value, may appear either as impossible to get back to or simply unacceptable. We don't want to go back. And we've heard some people talking these days saying, you know, we don't want to go back to the old normal. That didn't work then, and it's not going to work in the future. But there's also a temptation in the midst of disorientation for a restoration and a getting back to normal as quickly as possible. We need big crises, or we have big crises that need transformational change, but I don't see political support for those steps. Bernie Sanders and that branch of the Democratic Party was pushing for that, and they peaked out at 30% support for that type of transformational change. Current politics are barely able to do incremental change, and on top of that, we're getting the brutal politics and disaster capitalism that are moving us rapidly in the wrong direction. And the next steps of what happens to try and pull us out of the trauma of this pandemic will lock in place finances and infrastructure that will determine where we are going for the next 10 or 20 years, either in a good direction or not. My description for the day is that I talk about hope. I was trying to avoid that. But there are two senses of the word hope in English. One of them is optimism. I hope we get a vaccine for the virus soon. That sort of hope looks into the future for something with a desired outcome, and we usually have little control over it. And the more dramatic that hope is, the less likely we are to see it happen. The other sense of the word hope is about our commitment. I place my hope in democracy. That's something that happens right now about who we are. It identifies where we place our trust and where we're going to commit to doing our work in the world. I am not terribly optimistic about the state of the world these days. The challenge is to be grounded in hope, in values or in institutions or in communities that can sustain us and can actually be effective in working to make a difference in the world. So as we move into your turn on this, some questions. Is my take on the relational world and the great environmental crises accurate? Are there viable options for social change out there, and can they get to the transformational level? And how might the pandemic shape efforts at social change in the coming months? It's your turn. Any thoughts, comments, rebuttals?
Gary, do you want to talk about E.O. Wilson, which you mentioned?
Well, let me say, first off, that I think your summary is spot on.
I'm sorry to hear that. I was hoping somebody would give me a different view of the world.